Hi, everybody. My name is Alexandra Lee, and I am the director of Slut. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm so excited to be here with Vanity, who is going to be a part of our speaker series. Vanity, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone?
Absolutely. My name is Vanity Catoni-Ellis, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a sexual assault survivor advocate at First Step, which is a domestic violence and sexual assault agency in Wayne County.
Amazing. Okay, so let's get started with the questions. So the
Sure.
first question I have for you is, so could you tell us a little bit about what your background is with dealing with domestic violence and sexual assault?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started my work in this field pursuing my master's degree in counseling. Around that time, which was about 2015, I believe, I was interning in the domestic and sexual violence counseling program at Haven, which is in Oakland County. So shout out to them. I think from there, I just really fell in love with the mission of ending domestic and sexual violence because I really started to understand how pervasive these forms of violence were in our communities. So after graduation, I went on to do some home-based therapy work with children. And I came to understand very quickly that even though I wasn't working directly in the domestic violence and sexual assault field at that time, that almost all of the children and families that I worked with were affected by domestic and sexual violence. So in 2017, I came to First Step. I worked the first couple years as a children's advocate. I was able to provide some one-on-one counseling and safety planning, and just safe space for kids and teens to process the violence that they had witnessed and experienced. And then since 2019, I have been an advocate in our sexual assault program. So working specifically with survivors of all ages, ages 3 and up, of sexual violence.
Wow, that's that's pretty incredible.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so how can we as the audience or as people watching this interview, how can we contribute to fighting the causes that First Step fights against and support First Step?
Yeah, absolutely. So, really every one of us plays a role, an important role in helping to shape the culture and the norms around what either supports domestic and sexual violence or what condemns it, right? And so DV and sexual assault really happen in the context of person to person interactions. And so, really understanding that that stems from people's beliefs, internalized beliefs about power and control. And so for the audience, I encourage folks to really learn as much as they can about the truth of domestic and sexual violence, that these issues stem from power and control, to refute the myths and the misinformation that's out there, especially a lot of the myths that surround the fact that, oh, well, this type of violence is because the victim did something to set the perpetrator off. Or the perpetrator just lost control, right? Those are myths. And so we want to refute that. Um, and really just encouraging people to invest in and advocate for healthy relationship behaviors, to practice consent, to understand what that means, and to respect each other. And then as far as First Steps specifically, we just encourage people to help people know that we exist. We are in Wayne County, and your audience is likely going to be largely Washtenaw County. So every county has an agency like ours. And so even if folks aren't linked up with First Step, knowing that places like Safe House in Washtenaw County are available, and they can reach out to us for resources, for help, pointing survivors in our direction, volunteer opportunities, and all of that.
That was great. And you touched on this a little bit, but I also wanted to touch on why is it important that we discuss issues revolving sexual assault, domestic violence, and sexual violence?
Right. So, quite frankly, we can't address what we don't talk about. right? And so stats will show us that as many as 1 in 4 women, 1 in 10 men experience some form of domestic or sexual violence in their intimate partner relationships in their lifetime. 1 in 10 children experiences sexual abuse before the age of 18, right? Those numbers are staggering. That's a lot of people who are being hurt. Um, and those are just the survivors we know about, right? We know that accurate reporting doesn't always happen. And so if the numbers are that high with folks who are able to come forward, what about the folks we don't know about? So that tells us that these forms of abuse and violence are really happening at epidemic proportions, and that's even just inside the U.S. So by continuing to talk about these issues, we're raising awareness, we're bringing that out of the darkness and into the light, and we're working to change the culture. Right? Again, we can't address what we don't talk about, so we do need to continue to talk about this because it's continuing to happen.
Yeah, and something I wanted to touch on in this interview is your organization focuses heavily on domestic violence. And in the play Slut, which is the show that I've been working on for the past few months,
Yeah.
domestic violence is not something that is really touched on. These characters in the show are high schoolers. So that sort of sexual violence isn't, or domestic violence isn't present in the show. So I'm wondering if you could shed some important information about domestic violence and ways to prevent it, fight against it, provide support for victims that people should be
Mhm.
aware of that maybe we aren't discussing as much through this project.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing that I would start with is that when we talk about those numbers of domestic and sexual violence being so large, right, impacting so many people, it's also important to know that that happens across all demographics. Right. There's no community, no racial, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status that isn't impacted by sexual violence. And what we actually know too is that teen dating violence is very prevalent as well, right? So this is something that's happening with high school students, even though it's not portrayed. It's something that we know is happening. Um, and so DV has historically happened behind closed doors, right? And so victims are hurting and fighting for their lives behind closed doors. And we want to work to continue to bring that to light. We owe it to survivors to hear their truth and their voices. People really should know too that domestic violence really is an umbrella term, right? Domestic violence isn't just about physical violence. And that's what people a lot of times will think about, right? Violence, okay, we're talking physical. But really, when we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about a pattern of behavior. And that pattern can include things like emotional abuse, manipulation, financial control, telling you who your friends can be, telling you what you can and can't post on social media, where you can and can't go. And so it's just important, I think, for people to know that domestic violence happens in a pattern of behavior, right? There's not just one thing that qualifies as abusive or controlling. And so understanding that we never have to see bruises or scars to know that domestic violence is happening. And so that when a survivor does come forward, it's really important that we do believe them and we support them and we listen to them.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so I'm gonna segue to a little bit more of a different topic, but I was wondering if you could touch on how the portrayal of sexual violence, domestic violence, is how it's portrayed in the media, how it influence and how that portrayal influences our culture's perception of it, and then ultimately the work that you and First Step do.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. And so media is very powerful, right? Like media gives many of us access to stories and experiences that we're not necessarily familiar with on a day-to-day basis. And so media can either help to shape what's normal in our culture, right? It can tell us that domestic and sexual violence is normal, it's expected, it's okay, it's an everyday thing, or it can really highlight that, hey, this is a problem, we need to do something about this. And so when our movies, our TV, our music, when it portrays sexual and domestic violence in accurate and realistic ways, it really creates more awareness, right? And it draws attention to these stories that many people don't always get a chance to hear. Survivors get to see themselves in these stories when they're done well. And I've definitely had really meaningful conversations with survivors who will say, like, hey, did you watch that show, that new Netflix show that talks about sexual assault? Like, they really portrayed this well. And, I really could relate to that character. And I'm so glad that this is happening, right? I have conversations like that all the time where survivors are like, this is finally out there in an important and productive way, right? On the flip side, though, because media is so powerful, it also has the power to diminish and excuse this behavior. So just like survivors can see themselves and see hope and see change in media portrayals, they can also see that be trivialized and normalized. And so I think ultimately, when media portrays it and does it well, it works, right? It does what it's supposed to do. But we have to be careful about that, I think, ultimately.
Yeah, just to touch on that a little, I'm a in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, but I'm also a communications and media major. So I've also learned from my comm major how impactful media and television and anything that people can consume, how important it is in the ways that it shapes our culture and the way that we view things. Yeah, this question really resonates with me as well, because I've
Mhm.
personally experienced the feeling of when you see your story being portrayed in media and television and film and you feel validated and heard. But I've also
Right.
experienced that feeling for when you don't see that narrative being portrayed accurately or it being brushed over and not really addressed well, and how
Mhm.
that can minimalize or like make you feel as if what you've struggled with or what your identity, how it can make you feel, it can really affect you, and
Right.
it can change people's perception of things. So
Mhm.
yeah, I thoroughly believe that accurate portrayal and honest portrayal of these issues is so incredibly important. um,
Absolutely, I
which is
agree.
part of the reason why I wanted to do this show, because I felt the show
Yeah,
did a really great job of accurately and honestly touching on these really intense subjects.
for sure.
Okay, great. So another question I wanted to ask you is, how does college, university culture impact sexual violence and sexual assault? And
Mhm.
this is kind of a broad question, so you can kind of
Mhm.
touch on specific things if you want to, but that's something I wanted to touch on, as a lot of us watching this are students at the University of Michigan.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. I think that one thing to acknowledge is that just like the college environment can be such an awesome together to share lived experiences, to creatively explore these kinds of topics. And so I think similar to the media, it's kind of like a spectrum, right? Like on one end, I've seen colleges and universities be really forward thinking about sexual violence prevention, about raising awareness. Students who do creative work like what you're doing to highlight these issues, right, and to create, powerful change, right, on the community, on the college community, and to support survivors. On the flip side, I've also seen, and I think many of us have seen examples where sometimes colleges, administration will silence survivors, where the idea is to keep this clean and pristine perception of a college campus, where a survivor doesn't get to really highlight, hey, this is happening on my campus. I was hurt here. We need to do something about this. So I think it really depends on those key people on college and university campuses, right? Those administrators, those professionals who are able to create space where students can either, bring this to the forefront and really do some creative and awesome things, or to silence it. And my hope is that, we continue to see people speaking out, doing work like what you're doing, being creative and using their talents to, create this safe space for people.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, great. Those were all the questions that I had planned for us to touch on.
Sure.
Before we finish up, is there anything you want to leave the audience or the people watching this with?
I would just say that, again, thank you so much for having us be a part of this series. Um, I just want people to know that, First Step, like I said, is just one organization doing this work. But we are a team of people across counties, across states who are really trying to end domestic and sexual violence. And especially as we head into April, I would like to point out that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so just encouraging people to kind of be on the lookout for different things, especially from First Step. We plan to be doing a virtual campaign on our social media to just highlight different content to raise more awareness and highlight the ways that survivors heal.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Vanity. I
Yeah,
really
thank you.
appreciate it. And for everybody watching, please donate to First Step if you can. Follow their social media accounts and all of their information for fundraising and donating through the production of Slut is available on our Facebook page and on our social media pages. So check that out if you can. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah, stay tuned for Slut the Plague, which will premiere on YouTube on March 20th at 8 p.m. and it will be available to stream for 48 hours. So you'll have that 48-hour window to watch it.